Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Caneiro Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, an interview with St. Joshi.
And we're live.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to our friend St. Joshi. Welcome, sir.
Hey, good to be here.
We had our sort of in-depth read through of the I'll go with the mythos last year, but we did skip some, and I want to return to some stuff. And I'm not going to be, as I told you, as dogmatic this time around. Possibly more thematic. One thing I wanted to start off with you, though, is a friend of Lovecraft we didn't talk about, who actually is more famous than Lovecraft, possibly not today, even though his name still carries a significant weight, and that's Houdini.
He was a fascinating guy. I don't know a whole lot about him. There have been several biographies written of him, but the Lovecraft connection is really, really interesting. In sort of toward the end of 1923, Weird Tales, the magazine Weird Tales, had just been founded in March of that year, but it was already struggling and losing a lot of money. And so the publisher came up with this idea to have Houdini, who was, had been famous for decades, not only as an escape artist, but also as a debunker of spiritualism. And that's important. To write a column every month to attract a readership. Maybe people buy more issues if Houdini was around in the magazine. Although I think that Houdini actually didn't write the stuff. He got the publisher or editor got ghostwriters to write these columns. Ask Houdini. But then early in 1924, this publisher J.C. Henneberger said, well, Lovecraft had become by this time already kind of the star writer of the first year of Weird Tales. He published several stories already and that had gotten good reception. And he said, Lovecraft, I want you to team up with Houdini to write to collaborate on a story because Houdini claimed to have actually experienced a rather strange incident in Egypt, where he was like sent down this tunnel or some sort of cavity in one of the pyramids and had all this weird stuff going on. Lovecraft said, yeah, sure, okay. But, and I don't know that he actually met Houdini personally. Maybe it's possible Lovecraft actually went to New York briefly and met Houdini in New York, but I can't remember. Anyway, they corresponded apparently, and as Houdini explained this so-called encounter, this incident, Lovecraft, who actually had a certain knowledge of the pyramids in Egypt and history and things like that, said, "This is bogus. This is totally bogus. This couldn't possibly have happened." You know, he's making it all up. And so he asked the publisher, "Hey, let me just write a pure fantasy. I mean, let me just, don't hold me back. I'm not going to write a true account because there is none." So the publisher says, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." And at this very time, however, Lovecraft was in the process of getting married, and moving to New York to be with his wife, Sonia Green. Barely managed to write this story in time, which he called Under the Pyramids, but it was published in the magazine as Imprisoned with the Pharaohs. The thing is, he left the typescript of the story at the train station in Providence when he was coming to New York. He's like, "Oh my God." They had to get it to the publisher like the very next day or something, very soon. So he and his wife, they got married that day, March 3rd, and spent that evening retyping the story because Lovecraft happened to have brought along the handwritten manuscript, and I think she read the manuscript and Lovecraft typed it with his 2-finger typing. That's all he could do. And she says, "Yeah, after that we didn't have time for honeymooning or anything else," if you catch the meaning there. So that was not a good way to spend a honeymoon. But they got the story off. And then there was a further boondoggle because Lovecraft had written the story in the first person as if he was Houdini. And this kind of blew the mind of the publisher, because he wanted to put a byline, joint byline as by Houdini and Lovecraft, but he couldn't wrap his mind around how a first person singular narrative could be collaborative. So then he just left Lovecraft's name off of it and just put Houdini's name on it. And only after Lovecraft's death, when they reprinted the story in a 1939 issue of Weird Tales, did they have a little editor's note saying, "Oh, by the way, Lovecraft wrote the story." Houdini had other relations to Lovecraft. He wrote a book called A Magician Among the Spirits, which was his debunking of spiritualism, and he sent the book to Lovecraft. He gave the book to Lovecraft. So that was a nice gesture. And then he actually, when Lovecraft was in New York, he was struggling, couldn't get a job. Houdini tried a little bit to get Lovecraft some work, and it didn't really happen. And then a couple of years later, Houdini signed up Lovecraft to write a whole book about superstition, but then he died unexpectedly right around this time in 1926, like right around Halloween of 26. And then that project went bust. So
that was the cancer of superstition, right?
The cancer of superstition. They wrote a couple chapters. He and C.M. Eddy wrote a couple chapters, but that was it. And then Houdini's widow didn't want to pursue the project, so that work all went for nothing.
Is that in existence? Like, is it just notes or?
Well, okay. We seem to have an outline and a couple of chapters now. Some years ago, apparently some further material was discovered. I really haven't been able to get a look at it. And I did kind of get a look at it and couldn't decide if it was that part of it was written by Lovecraft or by C.M. Eddy. I actually think it was written by Eddy. It didn't strike me as Lovecraftian, but that text, that new material, hasn't been made public. It's still in the possession of whoever has the typescript. So it's out there, but can't read it yet.
Well, I know you're a devotee of getting your hands on every last word possible.
I would certainly like to get it someday.
Now you're a fan of Under the Pyramids. That's one of the ones I've seen.
I think it's a fine story. I mean, for what it is, Lovecraft was not really very good at writing stories to order. He didn't like doing that. In fact, he did write that earlier story, Herbert West Reanimator, and also The Lurking Fear, to order for this wretched little magazine called Homebrew. And Herbert West Reanimator, it's a famous story now because it's been made into films and whatnot, but it's an awful story. It's a really, really bad story. Lurking Fear is a little better, but still not a great story. Under the Pyramids, I think, has some really good scenes in it and really develops a fine sense of atmosphere and of Egyptian horror, stuff like that, and has a nice, powerful climax at the end, surprise ending. It's a fine story for being basically a pulp story.
It's fascinating to me because people always cite the end of Innsmouth as being the only action sequence, but I think
No, yeah, that's right.
Pyramids
There is definitely a lot of action. Although I think, I think Lovecraft was having a bit of fun portraying Houdini, this really strong guy, can break out of any, obstacle and things like that. He has the guy faint like 3 different times in the story, and I think he's like, all right, I'm going to make you look a little ridiculous in this story. But yeah, there's more action in that story than is usual in Lovecraft, and that's certainly one of the things that makes it interesting.
Yeah, as a narrator, it's interesting too because he's a very gothic male, right?
Oh god, yes. But that was the time. I mean, for Egyptian horror, that was really a kind of a big thing at that time. We have things like, you go back around the turn of the 20th century. You have Richard Marsh's great novel, The Beetle, which is all about Egypt. Bram Stoker wrote Jewel of Seven Stars, another Egyptian horror novel, and then Sax Rohmer wrote Brood of the Witch Queen, which is a surprisingly good Egyptian horror novel around 1920, I think. I can't remember the exact date, but something like that. And Lovecraft liked that book. It's a pretty good book.
Wrote that one down. I hadn't heard of that one.
Yeah.
I want to go back in Lovecraft's life towards his childhood. His unpleasant childhood, I'll say. He had some interesting relative experiences. I think probably everybody's aware that both of his parents were committed during his childhood. And of course, his father died shortly after being committed, about 5 years after being committed. Mm-hmm. His mother wasn't particularly kind to him. She described him as grotesque to him.
Yeah, okay. It's a very complex situation. The father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, was taken ill around 1893. So Lovecraft was basically like 2.5 years old in a Chicago hotel. Had brought back to Providence. It's kind of freaky. And spent the next 5 years of his life in Butler Hospital, which is still there as a mental hospital in Providence. It's now pretty clear he had syphilis. The medical records, which for him, which still survive, make that fairly clear. They didn't know what syphilis was, or at least they certainly didn't know how to treat it, and so they didn't even give him any medications, as far as I could tell. I mean, if it had been treated earlier, they might have been able to save it. But it appears he got this disease years before, even before he married. Let's be honest, he probably fooled around with prostitutes, when he was in his 20s or something. I mean, as a traveling salesman, that's kind of what you did. But Lovecraft's
really
mother,
Loman here.
Well, it's what are you going to do? He didn't marry until he was like 35. Married Lovecraft's mother. But she was, I mean, let's be honest, she was kind of a piece of work. The view of her should not be totally negative, because she did indulge Lovecraft in some of his childhood interests. She encouraged him to read the Arabian Nights. She did all this stuff when he became interested in Greek mythology, all this stuff. She gave him a chemistry set at the age of 8. So she fostered his early intellectual interest, and that was fine. But I think she was horrified at what had happened to her husband. I mean, she didn't know exactly what happened, but it was most unsavory, then and now, certainly. It's a horrible fate to meet anyway. And so she was saying, I have a feeling, she said, oh my God, I don't want my son to become like his father, and so she, I don't know, she restricted his activities. She, thought she kind of made him an invalid. People do that. I mean, that's, she was not alone in doing that. She tried to protect him. She was overprotective, didn't let him play, with his friends as much as he would like. But he, he kind of rebelled. He eventually got out there. He had his little core group of little friends, even in elementary school and certainly later on. But her psyche, she just sort of gave way. I mean, as the years passed, she began to realize that her son was frankly not going to make a living. and that was partly her fault. Let's be honest. She didn't train him or get him trained in some sort of, clerical position or something that could make him an income while he could do this writing on the side or whatever. And so her nervous breakdown, which happened in 1919, Lovecraft was almost 30 at this time, so he was not a kid anymore. That was because of her fears of poverty, of financial ruin. And she just went to the hospital for that, same Butler Hospital, and stayed there for 2 years and then died. But she died of a botched gallbladder operation. She just couldn't recover. It was, she had a weakened immune system or something like that, and she couldn't recover. We don't have her medical records, by the way. They got destroyed somehow. But I'll tell you, Lovecraft, obviously had a conflicted relationship with her, but he loved her. I mean, and when she died, he was very stricken. I mean, who wouldn't be? So the view of her should not be totally negative, but and quite frankly, I think Lovecraft is to be admired for coming out of her influence, after her death, and actually becoming a reasonably normal person afterwards. He really, made great strides in becoming a normal human being, really speaking, after she passed.
It is interesting. I mean, so the more I was thinking about him as a child, and the more I like the development here is almost, though, to me, like the entire family almost turned him into a vampire of sorts. He became much more nocturnal in its habits. Of course, he was into astronomy as well, so that didn't hurt. His grandfather Whipple, who was the financial patriarch, if nothing else, cured his fear of the darkness by making him walk through darkened rooms.
Yeah, interesting thing. It's a way to do it, I suppose. He worshipped Whipple. I mean, in the absence of a father, Whipple was basically his father. And there was also another uncle, Franklin C. Clark, who did a lot of good for Lovecraft, encouraged his writing and stuff like that. Unfortunately, Whipple kind of made and lost several fortunes along the way. His business acumen was not always at its best, and so at the end of his life, he actually didn't have a lot of money. He kind of died suddenly of a heart attack or something, and didn't leave nearly as much money to his heirs, Lovecraft's mother and Lovecraft himself, as they had expected. And so they were already, in 1904, already kind of not so well to do, and then that's when they had to move out of this huge 3-story house that Lovecraft had been born in, and moved down the street to a smaller house. And Lovecraft was like, he was shattered. He always wanted to return to that birthplace, but never got the chance.
And then the grandmother passes away as well, which apparently, triggered his night terrors, which he called night gaunts.
Yeah, the night gaunts. Yeah, this woman actually, Roby Phillips, wife of Whipple, died in early 1896. Lovecraft was like 5.5 years old. The thing is, the whole family, again, this is Victorian United States, and that era of the late 19th century, everybody went into mourning. All the women wore black all the time, and that totally freaked Lovecraft out. He'd never seen this happen. It was the first close person to die of his in his experience, and he just didn't know how to deal with it. And they remained in mourning, the whole family, for a long time, longer than usual apparently. And that's when these crazy dreams of night gaunts happened. And he thinks he was inspired by, maybe Milton's Paradise Lost. There were, Gustave Doré's great illustrations of demons, in hell, stuff like that. That kind of was maybe where the image of the night gaunts came from. Who knows? But it must have been terrifying for that little boy.
Did they do did the house literally go into mourning? Like sometimes they would nail up the black fabric to the walls and things?
That I don't know. All Lovecraft said was they just, the female members of the family particularly just wore black all the time, whether they went out or were in the house. And Lovecraft says, I had tried to pin bright pieces of cloth or foil or something to their garments just to relieve this horrible gloom, the black clothing, so it's like he was freaked out, I'll tell you. And he was a nervous little boy to begin with. I mean, he had all these, nobody really knows exactly his physical condition. I mean, or psychological condition, and we just don't know. We just have his own testimony for it. But, he was very nervous, very shy, and not, kind of, just a lot of things bothered him, I think, and he took things very seriously as a little boy. So this stuff really haunted him.
The night terrors persisted there for a long time into his life, and in one of his letters,
well, maybe. I mean, I'm not sure what the exact definition of night terrors is. Except, I mean, he had very vivid nightmares, to be sure. Although he says nothing like what I had about those night gaunts, later on. And he, in his letters, his letters are full of fascinating dreams. Not all horrific, but a lot of them are certainly. As we know, several of them actually were the basis for actual stories that he wrote. But yeah, his imagination was really quite something, because all entirely unconsciously, he, all these images came out. Didn't always use them literally from the dream into his fiction. Sometimes he transmuted them in interesting ways. Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if he was destined to be a horror writer just from those nightmares.
I mean, in some ways too, it sounds like sleep paralysis. And I want to give you a quote from a letter.
Yeah.
He says, "Do you realize that to many men, it makes a vast and profound difference whether or not the things about them are as they appear? If truth amounts to nothing, then we must regard the phantasm of our slumbers just as seriously as the events of our daily lives."
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I think sleep paralysis is a plausible hypothesis, certainly. Because I think Lovecraft also mentioned somewhere sometimes he felt overheated, too many blankets or stuff like that, and that might be one element of the sleep paralysis thing.
So I want to explore this idea of madness then, which is a really common theme in Lovecraft. Last time we talked about Dagon in relationship to this and the ending of Dagon, which you gave us the Lovecraftian explanation for the ending, that it is a hallucination, as some people think he actually sees Dagon. But I want to talk about it as both a familial theme and a condition in Lovecraft. So I'm going to return to my favorite, which is Innsmouth. So we have our narrator who, constantly mentions that he might be going mad throughout, and particularly toward the end of the story, particularly as he discovers about the Williamson side of the family. We have the uncle who commits suicide, right, Walter?
Yes.
And we know.
And then there's like that cousin. The cousin, was it Douglas?
Yeah, Lawrence.
Okay, all right.
The one who's in the.
He's in a madhouse already. That guy. And Robert Olmsted, the narrator, is gonna get him out of there and go to marvelous shadowed Innsmouth and go under the waves. That really is one of the incredible endings in Lovecraft. I mean, it's magnificent. Okay, and that ending certainly is ambiguous.
Oh yeah.
What does that mean exactly? Does it mean that the narrator Olmsted has sort of seen the light, and he's been converted to becoming one of the Deep Ones, and that's a happy ending? Some people actually thought that. I find that hard to believe. I think Lovecraft, as a writer of horror stories, wanted to show not only the physical horrors of Innsmouth, the actual creatures, these hybrid entities, that are mingling with human beings and producing even more hybrids, and basically able to live forever under the ocean, under the waves in that underground city. But I think he also wanted to show that the narrator's mind has been mutated, by this realization that he in fact is one of the old ones. So that to me is an intensification of the horror, not a lightening of it. I can see why some people might think that, there have been any number of stories written subsequently, inspired by Shadow over Innsmouth, that take a more sympathetic view towards the Deep Ones, that they're kind of like stand-ins for, maybe racial minorities or something who have been, scorned, and now they're trying to just live their lives, as it were. An interesting take on that idea, but I don't think that's what Lovecraft really had in mind. I think when Olmsted makes this decision to go back to Innsmouth and eventually, plunge into the water and live down in that city forever, that shows that his very mind has been corrupted, and that turns up the horror one more notch. That's always been my take on it.
Well, it's interesting because he first goes there in theory in dreams, right?
I can't remember. Maybe it's been a while since I read that. Yeah, but
well, because I wonder now if it's not just like Dagon. It's in his head. Well,
maybe, or that he was drawn there by some sort of external force. I mean, he thought, oh, I'm just going on a travel around the New England, just for fun, looking up genealogical stuff. But
I gotta tell you, college students in their 20s taking a summer break do very different things.
Yes, granted. In fact, this guy's only like 18 or something. I mean,
it's like a gap year from Oberlin, right?
I guess, yeah, right. But I don't know. He's a Lovecraft character, so what do you expect? It's just very scholarly, and of course, I love the descriptions of like, oh yeah, I didn't want to spend too much money. I don't have much money to begin with. A bowl of vegetable soup and crackers was enough for dinner. That's pure Lovecraft. But I'll have to reread the story sometime. But I think there's an implication that he was led there by this, by something, in Innsmouth that drew him there without his knowing it, and that all this stuff was like fated to happen. I think a plausible case could be made for that.
It is interesting too, because Lawrence, the character, seems to be a stand-in in some ways for Lovecraft's own fears in relationship to his family.
Yeah.
He is quite ugly, is how he's always described, right? He's locked up from a young age, sort of abandoned. His father is gone, right, because he kills himself.
Yeah, that's it. I actually never thought of that. That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's where his mother did a real number on him. What she said when we sort of passed over this, she said, "My son is hideous." I mean, can you imagine a mother? I mean, no matter how bad your son looks, like calling your own son hideous. But I think that was when she was in this mental decline herself, so maybe she shouldn't be blamed for that. But it clearly had a really bad effect on Lovecraft. He himself did consider himself very bad looking, and just like no woman could possibly be interested in me, blah 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 blah. He had these ingrown facial hairs that really caused problems, and thought they were kind of a disfiguring element, and so that's why he didn't like to show himself in public all that much. But yeah, I mean, I think maybe he was afraid that, okay, both my parents ended up in mental hospitals, maybe I'll end up there too. I don't really see that. Maybe that was in the back of his mind, but I think what Lovecraft did was, I'm going to pay attention to the mind. I'm going to be a scholar. I'm, insofar as I can. I mean, you didn't go to college or anything like that, but he learned a lot. He was interested in books and knowledge, and maybe he sort of downplayed his emotions because he was maybe afraid of his emotions, that they might lead him into bad directions. So maybe that comes from this fear of his own ancestry that he had.
You mentioned the fainting in Under the Pyramids. Of course, Olmsted faints too, twice, quite famously. Somehow during his escape, he faints, and of course, when his uncle pulls out the jewelry, he faints.
Well, that's almost become a kind of a joke in Lovecraft stories, but I think it's meant to convey the emotional power that these incidents have. I mean, imagine yourself in that situation. I mean, gee, you're being chased by all these horrible creatures, and yet, again, that's another thing. I've always wondered what those creatures were really trying to do. I mean, I don't think they were trying to kill him.
Yeah,
maybe they were. I think they recognized him. I'm not absolutely certain that there's any textual evidence of that, but I think a case could be made.
I think there
they were
is,
trying
because
to catch him and say, yeah, maybe there
they're
is.
discussing him at the bus terminal at the Gilman house.
That's true, yes, and elsewhere, yes, that's true. A number of places, yeah, they're trying to muttering. They can't. He doesn't really know what they're saying, but they're clearly talking about him, saying, oh, maybe they recognized him. He himself had not developed the intimate look quite then, at least to his understanding, but maybe they saw it anyway. Yeah, that could well be.
We were talking briefly that I've talked a lot about Dracula so far, and actually that scene reminds me almost of an inversion of the early scene in Dracula with Jonathan Harker boarding the carriage and things as well, when the people give him all the cross and the wolfbane and everything. It's the complete opposite, right? It's no, you're gonna stay, and we're gonna break the doors down in the inn and chase you through the streets. But no, I think you're right. I think it's they want to explain things and get him to take the oath and all that, and correct Zadok Allen's story. Poor Zadok, to live that old and then disappears.
Although I think he does die. At least I think narrator does hear of him dying, or he's vanished somehow when he comes back. So poor Zadok. Well, he was 96 years old. He'd lived a long life.
Yeah, I mean, he's like around during the Civil War and stuff.
I know, it's fascinating.
He fought in the Civil War.
1830. Oh, did he? Yeah, okay. Born 1831. Yeah,
remember, because he comes back. They convince him to come back because he says all things ain't so bad.
Right.
Let's see. So I want to relate this to the idea of sleeping and madness too, because that's one of the things that happens to Robert in the story, is that he seems to cease to sleep and his eyes start bulging out because he's not sleeping anymore and he can't close them. So if we go back to a story we briefly talked about last time, which was Beyond the Wall of Sleep, you get the same sort of sense between madness and sleeping as well.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's Lovecraft does this a lot. He writes a story early in his career, broaches some very interesting ideas, but doesn't really, they're not really quite effectively done because he was, very young, and he was out of practice of writing fiction. And then later on, he takes some of those same ideas and really develops them into a much greater and broader context. And I think Shadow over Innsmouth draws upon a number of earlier stories, including Arthur German, particularly, because that's another thing about hybrid creatures. That one is about mating between apes and human beings, whereas the Innsmouth is between these fish creatures and human beings. But yeah, I think Lovecraft recognized. I mean, Beyond the Wall of Sleep is actually, I'm sorry to say it's a pretty bad story. It just doesn't deliver. And I think Lovecraft recognized there's some good stuff in here, and let me reuse it in a better way.
The other one that comes to mind in relationship to this theme that we did not touch on last time, which is actually a fairly popular one, which is Shadow Out of Time.
Oh, I think that in fact, I was going to say Shadow Out of Time really is a vast rewriting of Beyond the Wall of Sleep. Again, you have this extraterrestrial entity that has occupied the mind of this, backwoods farmer in upstate New York. But that farmer's mind is not adequate for the purpose. It's like he's too stupid. Whatever. This entity can't work with this mind. It's not developed enough. And so he maybe tries to work with a narrator. But the Shadow Out of Time is just an unbelievable story. I mean, it's really, I think, probably my second favorite story next to At the Mountains of Madness. And here I think Lovecraft has gone almost entirely to science fiction. I think the horror element is actually way down. I mean he tries to make things horrible. I mean, and to some degree he does, in the sense of these vast spans of time and the idea that a human being can be transported backward millions and millions of years ago. I mean, that's certainly kind of a horrifying idea, but in some ways it's actually exhilarating. I mean, I would love to go back into prehistory, even if I'm occupying the the body of some, huge cone-like creature. Who cares? You're back in 150 million years ago. Boy, a lot of stuff you can learn about that period. I think Lovecraft was evolving more and more into, I wouldn't say a pure science fiction writer, but certainly heading in that direction. And that's one of the things that Shadow of Time indicates.
I think for me, if Lawrence in Innsmouth is what Lovecraft doesn't want to become, I think a Yith is what Lovecraft wants to become.
Absolutely. Because, again, Lovecraft's all about knowledge. I mean, that's his whole life was devoted to absorbing knowledge. And that's all that the Yith creatures do. I mean, they just want to have, they want to learn the history of the universe, basically, through means of exchanging minds with other people around the universe, and have them write their little histories of their own times, things like that. So sorry, it's my phone ringing.
You're fine.
Okay. But
it's a good Yith sound.
Indeed, yeah. little fluting voice there, but of course. I mean, again, Lovecraft tries to make again a horror scenario there, because the Yith creatures have some fear of what they call the blind beings, the creatures they apparently conquered when taking over that part of the earth when they came here. But those creatures are so vague, you don't really know anything about them, and so that kind of doesn't come off really. But yeah, so these Yith creatures, I think, are really admirable in that sense, that they're not really trying to conquer anything. They're not trying to dominate the universe. They just want knowledge and information.
I mean, the palace too is a great library, right? And the library itself features prominently as another theme we see in Lovecraft.
Yes.
For better or for worse sometimes. I mean, we've already sort of brushed over Herbert West, right? That the penultimate scene in Herbert West takes place in the library. And Dunwich Horror, obviously very dependent upon a library, and particularly getting a book out of a library, the Necronomicon. So I mean, the bibliophile nature of Lovecraft himself too.
Yeah, I've always felt that Lovecraft, obviously he was writing way before internet and stuff like that. The printed word meant a lot to him. I mean, it's a magical thing in some ways to hold a book, especially some old rare book. He had a book from 1567 in his library. He said, "Oh yeah, Shakespeare was 3 years old or something when this book came out." That was amazing. He got it for $2 in New York. You could still do that back then. Books meant a lot to him. I mean, he didn't have a lot of money. He couldn't collect a lot of books, especially not rare ones. But had 1,500, 2,000 books in his library, which is pretty impressive for a guy who didn't have much money. He was constantly going back to these books, trying to get the information out of there. And he used libraries a lot, wherever he was. New York Public Library, Providence Public Library. I mean, wherever. He said, "Yeah, this is, I want to know things."
As we established before, his favorite author was Poe, it seems, his god of fiction.
Oh, yes.
What particular Poe was Lovecraft drawn to?
Oh, well, there are a handful of stories, and he talks about them in supernatural horror literature that really meant a lot to him. I mean, certainly Fall of the House of Usher. I think Lovecraft adapted that. I shouldn't say adapted. I mean, drew upon that for a number of his own stories. I think the Shunned House is a kind of Fall of the House of Usher. Again, the idea of a single family and what happens to it, over the generations. Ligeia, I think, I think he drew upon that for the thing on the doorstep, where Asenath Waite is kind of like a Ligeia figure.
And his marriage.
And his marriage, to be sure, and his mother too. I mean, it's all in there.
That's the super Freudian story right there.
Yeah, really. Oh God, but Mask of the Red Death. I think that the outsider comes from Mask of the Red Death. I mean, even in some points of language, you can see that's where that's coming from. So there's a core of stories that really influenced Lovecraft, but he liked the whole of Poe, except for some of the the criticism nonfiction he didn't read much of, and the poetry too. He wrote a number of Poe imitations in poetry, especially using Poe, a certain type of meter that Poe used. I think it's called iambic trimeter, for your information. But Lovecraft used that in things like the Eidolon and the Nightmare Lake and a number of other poems that he wrote, which really have a Poe ring to them.
The Poe I was thinking of is the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket.
Oh yes. Well, okay, yeah, I have always wrestled with that story. Some people say, "Oh yeah, The Mountains of Madness is a sequel to Gordon Pym." I said, "No, it isn't. Not really. I mean, he mentions the story in there, but that doesn't mean anything." He may have drawn some sort of hints about where he was wanting to go with that Mountains of Madness from Pym, but that story has a lot of other influences if you want to go that way. In fact,
that was a transition I was hoping to get you into, so we're in good shape.
Well, I'll tell you, Mountains of Madness, I mean, incredibly rich novel. And when I say influences, I'm not suggesting that Lovecraft was imitating anybody. By that time, he had reached the stage where he could absorb all these influences and bring them out and still have, his own work there. It's 100% Lovecraft, but you can see where he drew upon other things. I don't know how much this has been talked about. There is a novel by John Taine, the science fiction writer. Taine, Taine, a pseudonym for the mathematician Eric Temple Bell. But John Taine was writing a lot of novels, pretty much pure science fiction in that day. He wrote a novel called The Greatest Adventure. You read that someday, 1928. There's a lot about the Mountains of Madness in there. And yet I cannot absolutely be certain that Lovecraft actually read that book. I think he must have, because there's a lot of parallels between those two works, but we don't have the evidence that Lovecraft actually read it.
Well, we've kind of covered in the course of a year that Lovecraft has like almost extrasensory perception about some things sometimes. Like he forecasts some things pretty well.
Well, maybe, but he left a lot of letters behind, but he's not going to tell you every single work that he ever read in his lifetime.
Sure.
So you kind of have to sometimes conjecture. Did he read this? Did he not? Well, there's a lot of parallels, so maybe he did. But yeah, that book in particular. What else?
What happened to his library after he passed away?
Interesting story. Okay. He made a list of the weird books in his library. He had quite a lot of weird books, 50, 100 books. He instructed his literary executor, R.H. Barlow, to distribute them among Lovecraft's friends, and Barlow did that. In fact, there's one book, I think it's Poe's Tales of Mystery and the Imagination from 1933, that it's out there somewhere. I don't know who owns it now, but it has a signature by Lovecraft, Barlow, and Clark Ashton Smith. Can you believe it? That would be what an incredible collector's item that would be, and is. So those books were distributed. His aunt, Annie Gamwell, after the death, sold a lot of books to this book dealer in Providence called H. Douglas Dana. And Dana was selling these books. He had a bookstore in Providence for many, many years, selling these books just over the course of years or decades, to whoever, one at a time. And of course, at that time, really cheaply, probably you can get a book for like $1 or something. Now they cost thousands of dollars, anything with a Lovecraft signature in it. But so that's how these books keep popping up, on the rare book market now, because they've gone through so many different hands. But a lot, there's still books out there probably that are in private hands or whatever. Some of them ended up at the John Hay Library at Brown University, but not a whole lot. I mean, they may have 20, 30 books, but and one interesting thing, Lovecraft, again, because he didn't have a lot of money, he bought a lot of those little Haldeman Julius books, these little books that cost a dime, nickel, some of them. Haldeman Julius was this publisher out in Kansas who published a lot of little books, tiny little books. inexpensively because he was trying to educate the masses, in that way. And Lovecraft just picked up a whole lot of these books. Just he'd take them on his travels, shove them in his pocket, just read these little 5-cent books just to pass the time. So we don't know where those ended up though.
So let's return to the Mountains of Madness. Let's not just leave them sitting there.
Yeah.
Why is it your favorite? I think people might be curious about that.
Because it, to my mind, Lovecraft's signature accomplishment is this element of the cosmic. That really is his defining characteristic as a writer. I mean, he didn't invent the cosmic by any means. I mean, he claims that the first cosmic work was Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin. I'm not sure I buy that because I don't think there's a whole lot of cosmic in there. And of course, but you can go to things like William Hope Hodgson's House on the Borderland. That's a tremendously cosmic piece of work, and even the Nightland to some degree also is. But Lovecraft didn't read those books until late in life. But he was the one who really established cosmic horror as a genre, because that's what he felt. It was the expression of his philosophy of human insignificance. The cosmos is so huge, both in space and in time, that we don't matter. It's a view that very few writers have adopted. I mean, it's kind of a bleak view of existence if you want to think about that. But that's how Lovecraft expressed himself as a weird writer, and to my mind, at the Mountains of Madness, gets that point across better than anything else in his fiction. And secondly, is The Shadow Out of Time in that same way.
Yeah, I mean, we talked last time about his relationship to the Burkean sublime as well, and I think it's felt through that. I mean, more so than anywhere else.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as a devotee of the 18th century, Lovecraft surely had read that work, and drew upon it or at least it went entered his mind, and it came out in things like that work, and even others like even believe it or not, even Dagon actually has cosmic elements. Beyond the Wall of Sleep has cosmic elements, but very rudimentary. He's just kind of broaching the subject there, and kind of doing it in a bumbling manner. I mean, he was working his way up to that, but it took him a while to kind of get his teeth into it.
It's interesting too, for somebody who loves knowledge, as we've established so much, academia itself, and people in my profession particularly, come off as a mixed bag.
Oh, to be sure. And yet, I like to think that my work and the work of other Lovecraft scholars over the last 50 years, I've been at it almost that long. I started very young, but I think we've made a lot of difference. In fact, it's funny. I don't know how extensively Lovecraft himself, his work is taught in classes. I think it is. I think at the Mountains of Madness actually is taught in various classes, whether it be for science fiction or horror fiction or whatever. He's getting out there, and I think when Lovecraft got published in the Library of America in 2005, I mean, that was it. He had made it. He's part of the American literary canon, and you either pay attention to him or not, but he's there, and he's not going anywhere.
No, and I mean, certainly you couldn't have a lot of American horror without Lovecraft, right? I mean, it would all be Southern Gothic essentially without.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, certainly Stephen King owes a big debt to Lovecraft. Peter Straub less so, but he did write that book called Mr. X, which is a conscious Lovecraft imitation. Interesting work. I'm not sure it really succeeds, but nevertheless interesting. And certainly a writer like Caitlin Kiernan. I mean, I think she's the best horror writer of her generation, and she owes a deep, deep debt to Lovecraft, and she's perfectly happy to acknowledge it. Ramsey Campbell too. I mean, he started out writing these, let's be frank, mediocre Lovecraft pastiches, but he was only a teenager at the time. What do you expect? But as he developed, and he developed tremendously as a writer over the years, he absorbed that Lovecraft influence and made it his own, so that he doesn't write imitations anymore. He writes books that are infused with Lovecraftian elements, but still remain his books.
In terms of Lovecraft's own reading list, his second favorite author seems to have been Algernon Blackwood.
maybe.
I got more. I'm just
He went
curious.
through phases. Of course, he had this idolization of Lord Dunsany for a while.
Yep.
Blackwood, it's very interesting. He first tried reading Blackwood in 1920, way before, he says he did. We found a letter from 1920. I think his friend James Morton had given him Incredible Adventures or something, and Lovecraft didn't like it. It's like, I can't make any sense of this, So he goes on and on about how mediocre or just he just doesn't get it, But then couple years later, 24, 25, he read The Willows, and that's it. I mean, he was sold at that point. He really thought The Willows and Arthur Macken's The White People, two greatest stories in weird fiction. Not entirely sure he's wrong about that, although I might put one or two of Lovecraft's own up there as well.
You bring up Dunsany. It is. I mean, I'll get more to Dunsany when we talk about Cthulhu. But he also makes mention in a letter that he does not like Dunsany's plays,
which is a shame. Actually, he writes favorably about them in supernatural horror and literature. I mean, maybe he's being kind or something, but I actually think Dunsany's plays are fabulous, and I would love to see them perform. But whatever.
It was more that they don't hold his imamagination, I believe.
Well, maybe. I think Lovecraft just didn't like the play form. I mean, he wrote one play. It was just a joke thing, early in his life, just for fun. But I don't think the play really suited his temperament. It's funny, though, when he was in New York, he actually went to a lot of movies, surprising number of movies.
That was a transition I wanted to make.
All right, we'll get to that. But he did see a few plays. Sonia took him to some actual dramas. Some Eugene O'Neill. I think he saw The Emperor Jones.
Really?
On stage, and he really liked it. It's like, wow, this is pretty powerful stuff. But on the whole, the play form didn't really suit him because, again, it's all about people, and Lovecraft doesn't care about people, so
right,
it wouldn't work.
No, he likes dreams, right? He says that I prefer dreams to people.
Yeah, sure. But
one of his people you've already mentioned in terms of the missing Poe book that is the highly collectible ticket item that Spooky Evenings watchers should be on the lookout for. Clark Ashton Smith, he called him the American Baudelaire.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you because I think Smith had this uncanny appreciation for that type of work, and I think Lovecraft admired that. Smith actually didn't come upon Baudelaire until like 1925, and I think he taught himself French, at least initially, for the sole purpose of reading and then translating Baudelaire, and he did it. It was pretty amazing. Smith ended up translating nearly the entirety of Les Fleurs du Mal, the Flowers of Evil. But a lot of these translations are prose translations. This is what he would do. He would do a prose translation first and then versify it. He'd versify a bunch of them, maybe 15, 20, I can't remember how many. But they're like 150 poems in Fleur du Mal, and he didn't get to them all. But those prose versions still exist, and we did publish them in our edition of Smith's Collected Poetry. But and he also translated Verlaine. He translated maybe Rimbaud. I can't remember. But he translated a couple other French writers too, and did a pretty good job of it.
So I do want to, we put a pin in Lovecraft at the movies, let's say, not Lovecraftian movies.
Right.
So I did a bit of research just to ask this question. I looked into the career of Georges Méliès and how he transculturated into America. And it seems that the main way that we got Méliès in American culture was through the pirating of Thomas Edison.
Yep.
So apparently Edison had a lot of Méliès films stolen from Paris and brought over and redistributed under the Edison film brand.
Oh.
So I was curious if you've come across anything, because I couldn't come across anything about a relationship of Lovecraft watching Méliès films.
I don't think so. I'd have to check, but I'll tell you, Lovecraft was a movie fan from a pretty early age. He was watching movies in his at least in his later teens, at least, if not earlier than that. He would go to those Nickelodeons, movie costs a nickel. He'd go there, see whatever. He was an early devotee of Charlie Chaplin. He wrote a poem about Chaplin when he was, like 1916 or thereabouts. Thought they were funny and entertaining. So, but yeah, one of these days I'm going to take all his letters and abstract all the stuff that he wrote about movies. It would actually make a very interesting little booklet, because he, especially when he was in New York, he would go to the movies all the time. Maybe other people would drag him there. So what? He still saw a surprising number of movies in his lifetime, and not just the weird stuff. They're all different types of movies.
Yeah, you cited in your going back to Shadow of Time, you cited Berkeley Square with the great Leslie Howard in it as a Lovecraft favorite.
Oh God, yes, and that's an interesting sort of time travel thing. Although of course that was a play first, and I think Lovecraft does say he saw the play as well. So that is a little exception to his rule that he didn't really like plays, but he saw that movie 4 times because he was so fascinated with it. And I think part of the fascination was, and maybe discussed this before, was that it accidentally was similar to the case of Charles Dexter Ward, which of course was still unpublished at the time, because the guy going back essentially into the 18th century, which is kind of what Ward does in effect. So I think that's what struck him about that play. But he liked historical pageantry, like he saw, like there's I think late in life he saw a play called, I think it's The Private Life of Henry VIII. I think Charles Lawton was that. And he loved that because he just, he loves England. He's a great Anglophile, and so he liked the pomp of seeing all these people in authentic costumes and things like that. Yeah, I mean, his appreciation of films was actually fairly sophisticated. I mean, we know, of course, notoriously that he hated both Dracula and Frankenstein because he didn't think they were adequately adapting the novels.
That's
but
fair.
If they weren't, maybe so. But if a film wasn't adapting a novel, it was just an original film, then he didn't have that problem with it, and then he could just enjoy it as entertainment.
I think we may have just inspired a dissertation this evening. Lovecraft.
I'll tell you, yeah. I mean, Lovecraft and film. There's a lot to be said on that subject.
Well, because everybody wants to do the opposite, right? They want to look at the derivative versions of film, but it's like, well, what was he ingesting? And I'm really, I'd be really curious if, because I mean, Voyage of the Moon just really sticks out to me as something he would have liked. It's got astronomy in it. It's got weird creatures. It's got bumbling professors.
Maybe I mean that kind of rings a bell. I can't quite remember, but I mean, we have 4.5 million words of Lovecraft's letters. I can't keep them all in my mind. So.
You don't have all 100,000 letters memorized?
No. But I've annotated all the letters that survive. They're actually only about, I can't remember the total number that survive, 5 or 10,000, maybe not even that many. So if you think about it, it's like we have like a tiny fraction of what he wrote. My God, can you think about it? I'm actually glad only those survived, because if all his letters survived, it would take like 10 generations of scholars to edit them. It would take 100 years or something to edit all these things. There's so much text, but
you're halfway there.
Maybe, I don't know. I'm getting, I wouldn't say I'm getting ready to hang it up, but we only have 3 or 4 more volumes of the Lovecraft letters to publish, and then we'll be done. There'll be like 22, 23 volumes of letters out there, and that is the totality of Lovecraft's letters that we know about. Maybe there are more out there, but and then they'll be made available in some sort of electronic form. We're not sure how we're going to do that, but then you'll be able to search the entire database of Lovecraft's letters and find exactly this kind of information. So who knows?
Yeah, sorry. my brain just went somewhere weird. Transitioning then, we've mentioned it a few times. I think it's probably now time to bring up Cthulhu, the probably most enduring Lovecraft character, even though he wasn't too fond of the character or the story himself. How do you account for that in terms of Lovecraft kind of meh about it? I think he called it middling.
Yeah. Oh,
Everybody, that's the one, right? That's the pop
he
cultural
was
one.
habitually downplaying his own work for a number of reasons. He felt that a gentleman, he considered himself a gentleman, well-bred person, does not praise his own work. I mean, that's considered vulgar. So he was always saying, "Oh well, I didn't quite deliver," and to some degree, he was there's a case to be made that what he had in his mind, his imagination, to his view, didn't quite come out in the written version. It didn't exactly come across the way he wanted to be, and that's where he felt some dissatisfaction. I mean, we of course don't know what's in his mind. All we can do is read the story and we say, "Oh, this is a fabulous story," but if Lovecraft had written the way he wanted to be even more fabulous, who knows? But that's somewhat what it is. The Call of Cthulhu, though, really is a tremendous story, and I'll tell you, when I was compiling my anthology, American Supernatural Tales for Penguin, and it was meant to be a historical anthology, starting with Washington Irving and going all the way up to Caitlin Kiernan. The two stories that stood out, I mean, way above the others, was Fall of the House of Usher and The Call of Cthulhu. I mean, they are masterworks. I mean, they are great stories, not just in the weird tradition, but in any tradition. I mean, they are two of the greatest stories ever written in literary history. And that complex structure that Lovecraft uses, going back and forth in time and using different narrative voices. That's what Lovecraft said. He called it cumbrous, but that was deliberate. I mean, he's forgotten what he was trying to do there. The mingling of voices, the way these things come together, emphasizes what he says at the beginning. The I can't remember what the expression was. The correlation of dissociated knowledge. That's the whole idea. You have different narrative pieces that somehow all come together to achieve this horrifying vision of this incredible monster living under the waves and still there. He's still there. He's not going anywhere. And so, the entire human race is under this constant threat that Cthulhu might emerge again. And that's the real horror of that story.
It's so interesting. I mean, our buddy Jonathan Chaffin named his company Horror and Clay after the first chapter. But it does remind me, I mean, Lovecraft early on, very fascinated with Greek and Roman stories. Is this his Pygmalion and Galatea moment with Cthulhu?
Oh, maybe. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Although Lovecraft, especially toward the end, I think, parallel Cthulhu with like the Cyclops or Polyphemus is the name of the Cyclops. So maybe that's in there too. But I think he was just trying to draw analogies to myth and literature to try to gain some idea of this indescribable creature. Really, I think the famous description, "A mountain walked or stumbled," that's like an incredible description. That is really the essence of the cosmic in my view.
There's a lot of people that cite different things. You get the Tennyson poem "The Kraken" cited from 1830.
Oh, no doubt.
You get the Guy de Maupassant story. You get Unsani. And you've also talked about Merritt's The Moon Pool in relationship to it.
Yep.
So, I mean, it's possibly the more literary, or if not the most literary, of his work.
Yeah, he drew a lot of stuff, but again, he made it his own. You can't just say, "Oh, I'm mechanically following one or the other." I don't think that's the case at all. And of course, his dreams come into it. Remember, he had a dream all the way back in 1920 about a sculptor who fashions something in his dreams and takes it to a museum, and goes on from there. He has this little entry in his commonplace book about that from 1920, 6 years before he wrote the story. So that gets worked in a fairly minor way in the story, but it's still there, and in some ways that is the nucleus of that story. So a lot of factors went into it, and I wish we knew how he came up with that name. I mean, he says, "Oh, I was very careful in coming up with that name." Well, that's not helpful. I mean, what does that mean? I once said, "Oh, he must have just banged his name on the typewriter," but obviously didn't do that. So I just don't know. I don't know where he came up with that name, and it'd be very interesting to know if he did or how he did.
We talked last time, I think, a little bit about it being almost Welsh.
Yeah, I think actually there's some old commentator said that, that Arthur Machen has a lot of, not a lot, but he has Welsh, words in his some of his horror stories, and there are very strange words. I mean, it's a very peculiar language for us, for as Americans, and even for the English, I think. So yeah, they use a lot of TH and L and things like that. So yeah, who knows? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's fascinating to me that it endures, right? At least and again, it's funny too, because you think about Cthulhu, he's sleeping, right? He dreams. That's how the prayer grows, right? He's dreaming. That again pops up in Innsmouth and other places. But I mean, that creature for some reason has remained. I mean, it's so pop cultural now. Right. And
really separated from Lovecraft. I bet a lot of the people who came upon that name or come upon it don't even know what its origin is. It's just out there,
Yeah.
It's which is fine. That's the way pop culture functions. That's okay. It is strange though, just because the name is really unpronounceable, and that you would think that'd be a barrier to getting it out there. Like, how the hell do you say this thing? But I think that Call of Cthulhu role-playing game had a lot to do with that. That got a lot of people interested in the entities of the mythos in general, and maybe Cthulhu in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I guess either him or the Necronomicon, right? Because the Necronomicon gets picked up by so many other authors, and of course you get like the Evil Dead picks up the Necronomicon in the 80s,
and the Simpsons,
and Guillermo del Toro creates a whole Simpsons Cthulhu Necronomicon opening for one of the Treehouse of Horrors, I think 3 years ago. But it is fascinating because I will be honest, I own a T-shirt that's a Peanuts knockoff called "The Call of Snoop Cthulhu."
Oh God,
with Snoopy as Cthulhu and Charlie Brown as Lovecraft leaning up against the cosmic doghouse.
I haven't seen that one. I have a lot of Lovecraft related T-shirts. I haven't seen that one though.
But it's just it's funny to me that sort of thing is just out there, and we sort of consistently see it as a digestible entity. Almost I mean, I guess people would free associate if they knew anything about Lovecraft. They might say Cthulhu, right? But that would be it. But they wouldn't have read it, I guess, is the other problem.
Who knows? But
so I had a friend of mine ask me to ask you about what is up with William Pugmire and where you're at with his estate and possibly publishing something.
Well, it's a lot of his work has indeed already been published. I'm trying to license foreign editions, and a number of foreign publishers, including I think some Russian publishers, Spanish, German publishers have come to me, about translating his work. Somebody is out there trying to do a kind of a tribute volume to him. I think he's having a little difficulty. We may have to kind of help him out a little bit, but I have to confess, I have a lot on my plate. I mean, I'm doing so much else, and as I say, a colleague of mine, Greg Lowney, who actually runs my website, my personal website, he actually is in possession of Willem's computers, and therefore he's kind of Willem's bibliographer, and he would know better than I what there is that is unpublished and what has been published. But I think the bulk of Willem's work is indeed out there already. There's not a whole lot that was left unpublished. Maybe another volume or two might come out someday, but we're still kind of sorting through all that stuff.
So as tomorrow is Halloween, will you be doing anything cosmically horrifying?
Not really. Just handing out trick or treats. I'll tell you, I as a kid, I just enjoyed Halloween so much. I just loved dressing up in whatever weird outfits I could find. Nothing terribly weird, but of course you love the candy. And I just it's. I mean, it kind of dismays me that Halloween has become kind of a fun thing and for kids. Horror to me it's a pretty serious matter, and to me, the greatest horror literature is literature. It's not just entertainment. I mean, it is entertaining, I think, but it can be on a very high level. And of course, the whole essence of Halloween, where did it start from? It's All Hallows Eve. It's an old agricultural festival that goes way back in time, to the Neolithic age and whatnot. Very important moment in the calendar of primitive man, because turning of the seasons and all that. It's kind of gotten watered down in some ways and made into a sort of just kind of a frivolous thing, and I feel that's a little disappointing. But nevertheless, it's a great time of year, and it's when we horror mavens should flourish, I suppose.
So let me ask you then, as a final question here, actually a two-parter. What should we be horrifying ourselves with tomorrow? What should we be reading tomorrow? And what should we be watching if you had your druthers?
Well, I'll tell you. Yeah, that's well. I mean, there's so much. I'll tell you. What can I say? I have come up. I keep coming upon new writers of horror fiction, and let me just mention a couple of them that are out there who've come to me personally, and I've helped them a little bit. One of the best writers out there is a man named Curtis M. Lawson, Lawson. He has done some really, really good work. Lives up in Salem, Massachusetts, an appropriate place to live for a horror guy. So he has already a couple books out there, and he's going to have more. Hippocampus is going to do a collection of his stories next year, probably. Let me think, who else is there? Jonathan Thomas. I wouldn't even call him my disciple anymore. That's an insult to him, because he's been around for a long time. He's just come out with a new collection, Avenging Angela and Other Uncanny Encounters. That's from Hippocampus. A fine book. It was much delayed, partially because of COVID, but we finally got it out. My second issue of Penumbra has come out. This is my magazine of both horror fiction and horror criticism. Also has a few poems in there. A lot of good stuff in there, I think. Literally just came out a week or two ago. So I think, a lot of small presses are kind of, hurting because, it's the whole pandemic kind of threw them for a loop. Some writers aren't really producing as much as they used to, but there's still a lot of good work out there, and we all should support the small press, because that's really where contemporary horror is at. So go out there and read something.
What would you have us watch?
I've never been a big fan of horror films. I'll tell you, I did do a study of Lovecraft's influence on very recent horror films. I thought that film Underwater was really, really powerful. My wife couldn't watch it; it was too depressing, and also too claustrophobic. It's all about the submarine and undersea adventure. It's a really, really chilling work. Go see that. I think that was really powerful. And I think, wasn't there a film called The Lighthouse or something?
Oh yeah,
I thought that was magnificent. I really like that one.
Everything Eggers is
that was
the height of horror for me right now.
You bet. So there's some good things out there. I don't watch the the Halloween films or the Freddy Krueger stuff. And that's just silly. It's ridiculous. And I don't like just a lot of blood and guts. I mean, that's not horror. That's just splatter, and that's an insult to horror, I think. You have to be a little more elevated than that. But there are plenty of good things out there.
So an A24 devotee perhaps from S.T. Joshi, if he's going to watch horror, or maybe something inspirational, maybe returning to Berkeley Square.
Yeah, who knows?
I want to thank you.
Just one more that I think I'm sure I've said this before, but this German production of The Color on His Face, called Die Farbe, which is The Color, from like 2010, 2011. eminently worth seeing. Really, really fine adaptation. It's
I tell everybody to watch that one. Actually, funny enough,
a little hard to find. I don't think Netflix has it, does it? I
it
doubt
was on Amazon for a long time. I own a
Okay.
copy, but it was on
Okay.
Amazon Prime for a while.
It's out there, so definitely go and see that.
No, I fully agree. I was obsessed with the idea of rereading and watching all these versions of The Color Out of Space in relationship to quarantine
Huh.
2 years ago, like when we first entered the pandemic.
Yeah.
I just
don't watch Die Monster Die again. That is
well,
that is a piece of crap. I'm sorry. I mean, yeah, I don't know how they persuaded Boris Karloff to be in that, but it's a horrible film. But it helped to get Lovecraft's name out there. That's the only good thing it did.
I want to thank ST Joshi for once again appearing with us tonight. I want to invite everybody to take the survey that Juan is dropping into the various chats right now. Also want to invite you to tune in and hopefully watch us tomorrow night when we have the great Lisa Morton on, as well as a screening of Werner Herzog's 1979 version of Nosferatu. And to remind you, as always, to stay spooky. Thank you once again. I feel like we get deeper and deeper below the waves each time.
Yes. Never-ending depths to Lovecraft, I'll tell you.
Yeah, now I'm curious. Now maybe I should write the book on Lovecraft at the movie.
I'll tell you, I'm gonna have to reread Shadowrunners, but it's, I mean, I thought I knew that story pretty well, but there are probably things in there that I kind of skipped over.
I'm obsessed with that story.
It is a great story. Yes.
A friend of ours, Mike Bennett, who is now sort of like getting his name out there because he wrote a vampire story that's getting picked up for a film version. He did a reading of it. And I just love his reading of it. It's quite good. I know the Lovecraft Literary Society with Andrew Lehman.
Historical Society.
Historical Society.
Yeah.
I know Andrew Lehman put out like all of it.
Well, yeah, and they also put out the entire At the Mountains of Madness on LPs, as I believe.
Yeah, I own it through Cadabra.
5 or 6 LPs. Oh yeah, that's Cadabra, right. They're real retro. I've done a lot of work for Cadabra. I like them because I still
they're fun guys.
Oh yeah. Well, I only know the guy, Jonathan Dennis, and
I
don't know anybody else who's there, but yeah, he taps me for a lot of stuff. Write liner notes and things like that. So always happy to oblige.
I've got a couple things I'm writing right now, but now I'm sort of thinking maybe the next one down the line might be Lovecraft at the movies, because I'm kind of obsessed with this idea now.
Yeah, I'm going to have to cull all this information. Now, there's a lot of it there. I mean, you'd be amazed. And I think I don't know how possible it is to see some of these films. Right? A lot of them are silent.